Guys, tonight we're going to go through and spend time looking at modules 11, 12, and 13, which are migration, worker migration and mobility, pay and productivity, and discrimination. And you'll find that these have their roots in things we've already studied, the metrics and the models and such, but maybe different ways of looking at them and different ways of reading model forms and such. So we're at a point within the term that you're being introduced to very few new kinds of statistics or metrics, but you're using those you're becoming familiar with in new ways. And that will continue through the union module we'll do next week, but when we do the module on inequality next week as well, which is the last module, we introduce a whole new set of metrics to think about measuring inequality and distributions, income distributions. Okay? All right, so let's talk about worker mobility. Think about worker mobility in the same vein that you thought about human capital investment. So Bailey, let's assume that you are born in Madagascar. Okay? I've never been to Madagascar, but I have this impression in my mind that it's not a well-developed economy, that there's not a lot of commerce and trade and opportunity, but you're a smart guy and you got some good skills. But my guess is your highest and best use in Madagascar is probably going to get you what you and I would each consider a pretty mediocre life, okay? Because not a lot of GDP, not a lot of opportunity, etc. You might choose to migrate to another country, New Zealand, the United States, England, and there'd be a cost associated with that, right? But you're going to do that only if there's a benefit associated with it. So you'll remember that in the human capital investment module, we said that the three inputs to human capital investment are education, health or health care, and migration. So this is where we can think about how you really posture those things. We won't go through and do a human capital investment equation, because I think you already know how to do that. But think about, instead of doing the one on education that you did within that human capital module, think about the cost of immigration and the benefits of immigration. So let's say that in US dollars, Bailey, you're making $20,000 a year in Madagascar. And in Madagascar, that might be living large, okay? But it's not living large here, and large there and large here are two completely different standards of living, okay? But you're a smart guy. You know that if you've been somewhere to college, maybe it's even locally, you're a smart guy, and you know that your highest and best use is as a nuclear physicist, perhaps. Not a lot of call for nuclear physicists in Madagascar, and that actually is a place. It's not just a cartoon in a movie, okay? So not a lot of call for them, but if you migrated to England, where there's great call for nuclear physicists, you would be able to enjoy an income, i.e. a lifestyle benefit, that might take you to $150,000 a year. It's going to cost you though, right? It's going to cost you the physical migration, airplane, move your stuff. It's going to cost you in terms of some of what we looked at as psychic costs. So in the human capital investment module, where we said you were used to the ocean around Madagascar. That's where mom lives. You're used to the cooking, the people, the language, the smells, and little of that is in London as you arrive in England. So you have to think about the costs and the benefits in the exact same way that we think about them in the education decision, and we can even morph that into thinking about a healthcare decision as well. But in mobility and migration, people migrate to affect benefits, right? I moved at one point from American Fork to South Jordan, and I did it so I could reduce about a half an hour from my commute. This is years ago. Moved into a nicer home where I felt there was going to be slightly nicer schools for my kids. Didn't increase my income, but it decreased my expenses and increased my utility otherwise. So the expense decrease I could model, right? Because a decrease in expense is as good as an increase in income. And the increase in utility meant that I could model it within my discount rate. I didn't require as much of a discount rate because I was picking up some utility. So migration can be looked at in the exact same way. But we can also look at migration within a supply and demand model, which probably doesn't surprise you, right? First, let's think about some of what we observe in migration. Have you both gone through and looked at the videos I've got on migration and immigration yet? Okay, so this will be new to you. So, but when you see it, maybe it'll make a little bit more sense. So it's interesting. We know that migrant or immigrant households, depending upon how far they migrate and how many barriers across which they migrate, end up having some effects. So if I move from Provo to Draper, well, not a lot of barriers over the point of the mountain, and not a lot of observable differences, right? But if I move from Guatemala to Chicago, big differences. Culture, scenery, currency, language, colors, language being a big one, right? And for whatever reason, we tend, and this is a discrimination issue that we'll talk about later, but for whatever reason in this economy, and I think most, we tend to think that if someone looks different and sounds different, that they think different. And we suppose their difference in thinking is lesser than ours. And because of that, they tend not to get as many opportunities as someone that doesn't look different and we doesn't suppose thinks differently. So I want to think about, for a minute, I want to think about the wage trajectory of an immigrant, first generation immigrant, and then we're going to extend that to the second generation, so their offspring, and then we're going to extend that to the third generation and do some comparisons against the native-born citizens, okay? So let's assume for a minute that here we have some kind of income level, and here we have years, maybe it's even age, such that here we got somebody at age 16 going out here to 65 and beyond, and I'm going to say that the wage trajectory for the common domestic-born worker is probably something like this. So this is domestic. Well, in the videos, I give you lots of numbers as to what some of those are like, and I'm probably more interested in what they look like than I am the exact numbers, because numbers change. So Nate, if this is the domestic workers' wage trajectory from age 16 through 65 and beyond, okay, if they stay in the workforce, what do you think that the trajectory looks like for the immigrant, the migrant worker who has crossed a lot of those barriers? Does it start below?
It probably starts below. And
Does it stay below?
I would imagine.
Yeah, I think so. In fact, I think we observe that, right? In fact, I think we observe largely that it starts below. It doesn't have as good as high a slope, and it peters out and starts to decline, where this stays relatively high.
I would almost feel like it would decline more rapidly because here, like domestically, like most people end their careers, you know.
Yeah, and it may well. That's a good point. That's a good point. So why does it start and stay so much lower than the domestic worker? Let's assume for a moment discrimination isn't part of the answer. Are there functional reasons?
Education, skill level.
So most of the places people migrate from have lower or lesser education systems, which begets lower skill levels.
Language barrier.
Big, right? So if I'm here and I'm from Guatemala and I only speak Spanish, then I'm having a hard time being productive around others that speak the native language, okay? And so this is a pronounced problem when we see this. It's interesting, the second generation has a different scenario altogether. The second generation starts their income somewhere between the first generation and the domestic born. Partially, Bailey, because they probably have a better handle on the language. Okay, that's why they start at a higher level. They probably have a better handle on education, because if they're second generation, they were born here. And first gen in this case means they were born somewhere else. Okay. So they're second gen, they were probably born here, they were educated here, but they may have some disadvantages. Maybe they come from a low-income household, maybe they come from parts of the cities or where they live that are disadvantaged for lots of other reasons. But they start here. What do you think happens to this trajectory? Does it stay between these? Does it come and cross down below this one? Does it cross above this one? What do you think?
I bet it lines up with domestic.
Okay, do you agree? You know, as it turns out, it doesn't. It's interesting. It beats the socks off of domestic. And it's worth talking about why. This happens, by the way, at about age 30 to 35. And it's worth talking about why this second generation beats the domestic income trajectory. So Nate, you're my son. I'm first gen, you're second gen. I was born in Guatemala. You look like you were. Okay? You speak both languages, as it turns out. I still speak Spanish really well and can barely get by in English. Okay? We understand why my trajectory is down here. We're trying to figure out why yours isn't. Well, the language issue and the education issue alone probably cause you to start out at a higher level. Okay? But the discrimination issue and a little bit of cultural barrier, etc., might cause you to start out lesser than the domestic born. All right? It's this slope of the trajectory, and as it goes further out, that's interesting to us. So as it turns out, if we were just living back home in Guatemala, you'd have regular Guatemalan opportunities, you'd have regular Guatemalan incomes, you'd have regular parental Guatemalan expectations. But that's not the case, man. You might remember from the stories your mom and I have told that we sacrificed everything to raise you here. There is no way in God's green earth we're going to let you waste that sacrifice. You study harder, you are motivated to make my pioneering sacrifice worthwhile. And interestingly enough, that factor causes this effect. Now it's kind of exaggerated the way I've done my graphics here, okay? Conceptually this is correct. The differences are not as obtuse as you see here. It's interesting. You have more small businesses created by second generation immigrants than you do domestic workers. More small businesses. First generation immigrants start them as well, but not at the rate that either domestic workers or second generation. Why is that? Why do you suppose second gens create more small business than domestic workers?
It's the American dream. It's
The American dream. Yeah.
Do it.
In fact, that's why we came, right? We came for the American dream. And so, again, the father-son relationship, I've been prompting you to do this since you were a young man. I'm also helping you with some of the savings to do it. I'm helping you with some of the mindset, with some of the sacrifice and such. We find ourselves very concerned socially about immigration, and suppose that first and second generation immigrants tend to create a burden on society. And in some places and in some households they clearly do, but on the whole they clearly don't.
Is this overall statistics, or is it like nationwide? Is it?
This would be nationally. Now we clearly can look at some parts of the country in which this likely would not hold.
Okay, that's what
Okay?
I was gonna ask.
Yeah. We can look at certain cities in which this does not hold. But we can look at others where the slopes, the differences are yet more magnified than they would look like here.
Okay.
There's an article written by a guy named Giovanni Perry. And if migration and immigration is interesting to you, and looking at the pragmatic elements of it, let me know and I'll make that article available. If this were a full semester class, it would be part of one of our Canvas discussions. But you might know that we don't do those
Can you make that
discussions.
available?
Yeah, and just shoot me an email.
Okay.
And I will, I'll send you guys, I'll send both of them, a copy of it to both of you. It's really interesting. It's not a short read, it's one of these academic articles, but it's an easy read if you're interested in migration, okay? So this is a phenomenon, and we see the trajectory here, and we see it go higher above the domestic worker because here, Bailey over here, you were born in a household where mom and dad were born in the United States, their parents were born in the United States, their parents were born in the United States, and so land of opportunity, what are you talking about? This is just commonplace to you, right? But Nate sits here, second generation, he's got all this pressure and all this opportunity and has to realize the dream to make sure that the sacrifice of the parents was worthwhile. And it's really interesting to see this in action. Okay? What do you suppose happens now to the third generation? So the offspring of the second generation. What does their trajectory look like?
But it's domestic.
It's domestic. Why?
They're
domestic.
Yeah.
They're domestic. If your household's been here for 3 generations, but I'm here to tell you, you are part of the fabric, right? They are domestic. So they're native born at that point. Whether they're citizens or not is irrelevant, but they're native born. I guess they would be citizens because they were born here, okay? Let's separate for a moment, and I don't think I say anything in the videos about this that I can recall, but I have an article online that you guys have access to. Let's talk for a brief minute about the differences between immigrant households and refugee households. There's a technical, legal difference. All refugees are immigrants, but not all immigrants are refugees, right? And immigrants tend to come here in part because something is pushing them from their native country. Maybe it's economic factors, maybe it is, maybe it's climate, maybe it's geography, maybe it's religion, maybe it's politics. Something pushes them, but the push factor isn't necessarily that strong. It might be, but it's not necessarily. But there are pull factors that cause them to go someplace. So let's say that, again, I was raised in Guatemala, and drugs, poor economy, I frankly hate humidity and bugs, so Guatemala, not so much for me. But the United States, in fact, Utah, dry climate, drug abuse is lower than it is in most parts of the country, education is good. So what pushes me out of Guatemala is uniquely separate from what pulls me to the U.S. Because I could have just as easily been pulled to England or pulled to Spain or pulled to Japan. I left Guatemala for some reasons. I went to these other places for different reasons. And I did so by choice. I chose to integrate, I chose to learn language, I chose to become a naturalized citizen if possible. I chose all these things because I came to this land of opportunity that was so attractive to me that it pulled me there. Think about the plight of refugees. And by the way, because of that, by the time the second generation has come about, we are grossly economically productive. Even the first generation has a positive contribution to GDP within immigrant households. Refugee households, statistically not so much. The push factors that push them out of their native countries, yet stronger on average than push factors for typical immigrants, right? But the pull factors may not exist at all. What's forcing them out is the primary motivator. And in fact, in most refugee allocation programs, because there are quotas and allocations, if I'm a refugee coming out of Somalia, or whatever hellhole I come out of at this point, all I really want is to leave Somalia. I might have a preference as to where I go, but there's a really good chance that I don't get to go where my preference is. I go to the country I get allocated to, or I stay in the camp for another 5 years. Okay? Well, that affects many things. I'm not as motivated to learn the language. I didn't go to that other country because of the opportunity. I maybe don't want to integrate into the culture. And all of a sudden, I've got this whole basket of conditions that cause the refugee household to not become economically productive until the third generation. The second generation is making up for the economic costs of the first, and the first generation in the refugee household is terribly costly. The federal programs, state programs, social programs, healthcare programs, I mean, across the board, they're very costly. The second generation kind of makes up for that. The third generation finally becomes economically productive. So when a nation...
And that's with refugees.
That's refugees.
Okay.
That's refugees. Immigrant, completely different. Immigrant, non-refugee,
Right.
completely different.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so it's really kind of interesting. Frankly, I get why so many nation states are concerned about bringing more refugees in. We've seen numerous problems, some of them you even see in the media. I don't get in any way, shape, or form why households and nation states, or actual states, municipalities, are concerned about immigration, non-refugee immigrants. Think about it. Do we have any evidence in front of us that mass immigration into this country creates increases in GDP and lifestyle? Do we have any evidence of that? Or do we hear, anecdotally, evidence of just the opposite? We hear it all the time, don't we? I'm going to show you some models that refute it, and if you read Perry's article, it refutes it. I like Perry's article, not because he's a leftist, because he's not, but because, and not because he's just pro-immigration, which he is, but because he's pragmatic, and he gives some really good, focused, pragmatic issues and concepts. So think about this. We started as a nation of some millions of English citizens back in pre-1776, and from that point forward we became a mass immigration locale, right? The Chinese came, the Polish came, the Germans came, the Scandinavians came, more recently Hispanics have come, but every time you look at this, we see that immigration, not necessarily refugee, but immigration has increased GDP, and not just by inflation, has increased real GDP. Think about the massive change in GDP as we went through the Industrial Revolution and needed that large body of workers. It was substantial. Well, we can model that. And so let's look at the LS and LD relation conceptually, and then we'll look at it with some numbers. So we'll say labor supply of domestic workers, so the ones that were here before migration, and labor demand. And we know that's going to give us some some W star, and some L star on a wage and labor axis structure, right? Well, any good economist will tell you that when supply increases, that we then have a change in W star and L star to W prime and L prime, right? And this is the concern about immigration. The concern for immigration that happens in so many locales and households is, hey, if we bring in more workers, that's an increase in labor supply. The labor supply curve shifts out to the right. It's going to suppress wages. Wages are going to come down. Yeah, the fact that the number of workers went up is fine, but wages are going to come down, and that's going to affect me. That's the classic story. That's the anecdotal story that you hear certainly in more recent years. What element is missing in this?
What did the blue line represent?
This would be the new labor supply
Okay,
once
so the
immigrants
new-
came, such that the labor supply for domestic plus labor supply of those migrant workers would equal the labor supply total. That's what this T means, is total. Okay? And we're going to use some numbers in a minute to help this even further. So this is the classic story, right? But what's missing in this story? Any ideas? Think about this. You're a grocer, Nate, and you're a home builder, Bailey. Whether it's luxury homes or tiny little apartments makes absolutely no difference, okay? When there are more people living in the domestic economy, do we need more housing? Yeah. Do we probably need more groceries? Yeah. So do we need more people, workers, to build housing and distribute groceries? So you just suggested that labor demand shifts out also. Okay? And maybe it shifts out in such a way that for some skill level, we actually still see some suppression of wages below W star. But it's interesting. That skill level for which we see any downward pressure of market wages is exclusively the least skilled in the economy. And it makes sense, because if again, the bottom on me, when I showed up, I can't speak the language, I can't evidence my intellect, I can't even communicate well enough to order a hamburger maybe, but I can dig a ditch, right? I can sweep, I can clean, I can pound, maybe after all I can drive. These are the lowest skilled positions. And here you, and I'm sorry for a minute, Nate, I'm going to suggest you're one of the guys in the economy, and by the way, you have a hard time lighting a candle. Your intellect, you're alive, but you are also a low-skilled worker in this economy, but you speak the language. And now, whereas you would have been simply a regular worker in this low-skilled labor crew, if there are labor crews filled with people like me, you're a supervisor now, right? Your relative skill level, if for nothing other than your understanding of culture and language, is increased, and you probably got a raise. The grouping for which this scenario exists and this suppression of wage is real is the high school dropout that has a very challenging time, or the lowest skilled in the economy. But for all others, the story is a little bit different. I won't use the different colors this time. So LS, this is domestic, LS total, LD, and then when the LD comes out, LD prime, such that this original trajectory, L star and L prime, and W star is returned. And we do not see real decreases in wages across the economy on average for anything but the lowest skill sets. And we're going to model something here in a minute numerically that is going to be more supportive of the low skill set than it is of the non-low skill set. But it's interesting. In fact, we have a lot of evidence that for some skill levels, that wages actually rise. And part of that evidence you see around you. As our economy gets bigger, wages tend to rise. Real wages tend to rise. It's what's happened for the last 270 years. Okay? So this is the classic story, and the classic story leaves off this shift in labor demand. If you could convince the Trump administration or the governor of Texas or Arizona, where they have major immigration issues, right? That labor demand is shifting outwards, and so wages are not being suppressed abnormally, the story would be very different. So why is it that we hear different stories in the media?
Focused at the high school dropout.
A lot of it is. Okay, it's focused to the parts of the economy or the labor force that are problematic, right? Anything else? Well, think about it. And this, come on in. Man, this is perfect time. So, like I said, small grouping tonight.
Okay,
Okay.
and I'll put the URL up on the board.
Is it
or-
this?
Yes, that's it right
Cool.
there. So I know.
Very good.
So I'll just plug this real quick. This is for the Sandy Center. This is so that we can bring amenities out to the site. That's, through these surveys is how we've been able to get the new expansion with the 3 new classrooms and the say rooms that's gonna open in January. It's also how we've been able to get the counselors that are coming out weekly now. So it does help to bring things to site. It takes 5 minutes and you can do it on your phone or tablet.
I can see if you don't want to pull it up. Are we just using that URL?
Yeah, just use this URL. That's an L. It is case sensitive, so it has to be all lowercase or it won't work. Pretty straightforward. And I think it's got like 15 questions. It's pretty quick.
If you'll email that to me, I'll
Yes.
broadcast it out to all the students in the class
Awesome.
with the explanation.
I can forward it to you right now.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't realize that there were some new classrooms and such going online.
Yeah, it's pretty,
Very good.
we're pretty excited.
Cool.
Lynn's desperately trying to get furniture shipped here so we can have it ready for the spring.
That's coming at you.
Yeah. Way faster than I'd like. Okay, let's see here. What email with address do you want me to forward this to?
Send it to rick.haskell@utah.edu, and Haskell has 2 L's. rick.haskell@utah.edu. Yep,
Okay.
very good.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys. Have a great class.
Thank you.
So let's run some numbers with this, and you're going to see a couple of things develop as we do that. Okay, so I've got a couple of equations over here. I'll replicate them, make it easier. I've got labor supply, domestic, equal to -30 plus 6W. I've got labor supply migrants of -10 plus 4W. And I've got labor demand of 170 minus 2W. And I've got this labor demand prime that I'll explain in a moment of 195 minus 2W. This, by the way, is one of the review problems. Okay? So you ought to aces. Okay, so as I put this together, in looking at this labor supply, can I tell immediately whether it's going to cross the X or the Y axis? Do you guys recall? There's a trick that I've tried to teach you. When the constant is negative, it's going to cross the y-axis. Okay? So, labor supply, domestic workers, labor demand. We can put some numbers to this now. Labor demand, which is here, 172W. So it's going to come here at 170. And it's going to be up here at 85. Labor supply is going to be down here at -30, but it's going to be out here. We want to find that point. So 30 divided by 6 is 5. I come across like this. Okay, and I can equilibrate them. So I can find my W star and my L star. So let's do that. So -30 plus 6W being equal to 170 minus 2W, or that's going to give me 8W is equal to 200, and W I think is equal to 25. Is that right? 200 divided by 8? It's 25, I believe. It's going to look like that. And then I can put that 25 for W star into either of the equations. I'll put it here into labor supply domestic. So 6 times 25 is 150, minus 30 is 120. So here we have 120. So this is our initial condition before some migrants come into the economy. Well, unlike the first picture I showed you, I haven't expressly given you a labor supply total. I've given you labor supply domestic and labor supply migrant. So we have to think about what is the labor supply total going to be, right? We wouldn't necessarily model simply labor supply migrant. We want to know what the total labor supply is going to be. Well, it's actually fairly easy. We take LS of domestic plus LS of migrant to get the total. So negative 30 plus 6W plus negative 10 plus 4W. Because of the way it's constructed, I can just get rid of the parentheses. And I can just aggregate these such that I now have a labor supply total being negative 40 plus 10W.
And that number is what again?
This would be the labor supply domestic plus the labor supply migrant equals the labor supply total. Domestic plus migrant equals total. So if we know those are equalities on the left-hand side, then they're equalities on the right-hand side as well. Okay? And it literally, Bailey, is as simple as adding up the right-hand side. Okay? Some people make this really difficult. It is not necessary.
So
Now,
can you just use the labor supply total as your equation at this point?
that's exactly what we're going to do. But we're going to do that and use the other ones for a few moments,
Okay.
or in a few moments, okay? So in this case, I now know that we have some additional labor supply, and that labor supply probably is going to come across here something like this. It's labor supply total, okay? And it's going to come across here at 2.5. And I want to find the new equilibrium, which is going to be right here. And so I can now equilibrate that with my labor demand. Labor demand is constant for us. Our demand for workers hasn't increased by firms just because these people immediately showed up. There might be an increase a little bit later on as they start to integrate within the economy. So I just remember I've got my LS total of equaling negative 40 plus 10W. I think I have given this the wrong number. Hang on a second. It's 4, not 2.5. I apologize. And you can find those numbers, those intercepts, the way that I've taught you to find intercepts. There's a trick to it, though. Take the constant and divide it by the scalar in the variable. Because effectively, that's what you're going to end up doing, right? And that's how you find the intercept for this one. Okay, so let's go ahead and think about equilibrating this such that we've got labor supply total equaling labor demand, or negative 40 plus 10W being equal to 170 minus 2W, or 12W is equal to 210, or W is equal to what? My calculator over here. 210 divided by 12, 17.5. And that's, I'm going to call it W prime just to differentiate from W star, okay? Okay, so now think about this. If that's where we stop, domestic workers and migrant workers are now both subject to this new market wage, aren't they? Unless there's some wage floor or, you know, something else in place here, okay? But if this is a competitive market, all of them are subject to that. Let me put this down. And now we have to think about how many people are working. So let's go ahead and put that 17.5 back into either one of the equations. I'll use the LS total, put it back into. So I multiply it by 10, and then I subtract 40, and I've got L prime at 135. So yeah, I've got more people working, but each one's making less money, according to this very classic argument. Okay? And that's the end of the classical argument. But as I suggest, there's a heterodox argument, or one that just expands it further, that says, nah, it's not that easy, because once these people begin to integrate into the economy, the migrant workers, then there's going to be more goods and services that are required. But let's challenge that thought for a minute. Most of those migrant households, are they buying goods from Nordstrom's and Whole Foods, and are they buying luxury homes? No. To the extent they're buying goods, they're buying low-cost housing. They're probably shopping at the Walmarts, Targets, etc., or even less expensive places than that, where most of the products are imported from foreign countries, right? Even the Nordstroms and Whole Foods, a lot of that's coming from outside the country, right? So an argument sometimes is made that, yeah, there are more people in the economy demanding more goods and services, but the vast majority of that which they demand is being produced elsewhere and not using domestic labor or labor within our national boundaries to create it. And it's a little hard to immediately argue against that, except for when you stop and think about where the majority of spending goes for any household. It's hard to build an apartment building in China and install it in Sandy, isn't it? You pretty much need domestic labor to do it. To the extent that product comes in from China or Madagascar or Indonesia that's headed towards Walmart, it might have been manufactured in those other places, but the moment that it hits our border, it's being driven by, distributed by, warehoused by, clerked, sold, etc. by workers here in this country. So that even though, yeah, globalization has kind of diluted the effect of this, we still have a grossly positive effect on labor demand, because so much of what supports the household, high income, low income, I don't care what the skin color is, how they sound, or what their last name is, so much of it is with domestic labor, or labor that's here within the national boundaries. So we see the story. And now we say, okay, fine, you're going to buy my argument that labor demand is going to shift out, shifts out to the right, such that we've got something happening here, where we've got 195, and 195 divided by 2 is going to put this intercept at 97.5. And we're going to draw a new equilibrium here, such that we're going to now equilibrate labor demand prime with labor supply total. So 195 plus 2W is going to then equal, what do we say, the negative 40 plus 10W, or 12W is equal to, what, 135. 135 divided by 12 is 11.25. Something wrong. 195, oh, 235. 235. 235 divided by 12 is at, W is equal to 19.58. That's W, and I'm going to call it prime prime, and then L prime prime is going to take that, we'll put it into the labor supply total equation, and we end up at Better do it again. $155.8, such that this new location here for L prime prime is at 155.8, and our equilibrated W prime prime is at 19.58. Remember that we had a W prime here at 17 and a half. Okay, so let's make sure that we understand what each of those numbers really is telling us. The W star of 25 is the wage that was being paid in this market for workers prior to the introduction of immigrant labor force. By the way, that immigrant labor force might have come from another country, or it may have come from another county. We have mass migration coming out of North Dakota right now. You might understand why, Bailey. Do you understand why?
Oil fields.
Oil fields are becoming less economically efficient to produce from. So a
And that's
lot
all
of
that's there.
Pardon?
I said, that's all that's there.
Well, that and corn, right? And some of that area doesn't even have corn. Okay. Yeah. So and then a lot of that's coming into Utah. Fortunately, our labor demand is increasing more dramatically than our labor supply, so we don't see a negative effect of it. It can be St. George to Payson. It doesn't have to be Mexico to the U.S. Okay. It's mobility. It's migration. That's all it is. So the 25 was our initial condition. When we added the new labor supply here and didn't change labor demand, it brought about a decrease in wages, exactly as the classic story would tell us, and an increase in workers. But when we then thought about the increase in labor demand because of the additional goods and services that these workers in their households were then needing to consume, and the workers necessary to manufacture those goods and services and distribute them and transport them, etc., we then saw an increase back towards the 25 level, okay, at 19.6 essentially. Yeah?
So do you see the same graph or chart, like you said, when it's state to state or city to city?
Pretty much not. The only time you see anything approaching that is when it's somebody that's coming from a part of the world or part of the country where they have serious accents. So I come to Seattle from Biloxi, Mississippi, and I'm telling you, especially if I happen to be black, right? And so in Biloxi, I didn't have very good education experience. My accent is very southern, right? Even though I'm in the same country, I got a problem for a while, at the very least. I come from San Jose, California, to Denver, Colorado. Can't even tell, right? Can't even tell.
So you say the main factor in that is the language.
Yeah, big factor. So think about language and culture. And then think about this as being a function of drive and motivation. If I moved from San Jose to Denver, is that a big move? No, what, 2.5 hour plane ride, maybe 15 hours in a car, 18, I don't know, something like that. Yeah, it cost me some money to move my belongings, but I'm still surrounded by the same language, the same culture, the same native foods, everything. And frankly, I'm happier because I no longer have the congestion of San Jose. Anyway, so this is a story. And when you listen to the videos, think about push and pull factors. People get these confused. Push factors are what cause us to leave a given area. And they're predominantly, if not exclusively, negative. I don't leave an area because it was so good, right? They might be economic, they might be education, they may be health, they may be climate, they may be geography, they may be politics or religion or whatever it happens to be, but they're negative, they're oppressive, they're causing me to want to get out of Dodge. Pull factors are expressly positive, and they're what attract me to a place. You will certainly see an opportunity on the final exam to discuss these, and try not to get them backwards. People very often get them backwards, and I don't really understand quite why that is, because they're pretty obvious to me. Okay, any questions about, yeah, I know. It should be obvious to me, right? Okay. Any questions about any of this? Okay.